The glorified internships. Hey guys. Tonight we begin with something that sounds exciting on paper but was actually just a logistical nightmare. We're talking about medieval knights. You know, the guys in shiny metal suits riding big horses, saving the day, and attending fancy feasts. It all looks very romantic in movies. They always seem to have perfect hair when they take their helmets off. But the reality was mostly just being uncomfortable, damp, and constantly broke. It was a career path defined by bad smells, heavy lifting, and waiting around in muddy fields for something to happen. So, dim the lights, get cozy under the covers, and let's drift off thinking about how much better your life is than Sir Reginald's. Because trust me, it is. Let's start at the beginning. You didn't just wake up one Tuesday and decide to be a knight because the job market was tough. It was a whole thing. Usually, your dad was a knight. And his dad was a knight. It was a hereditary affliction, really. If you were born into the right noble family, or the wrong one, depending on how you look at it, your career path was set before you could even walk. You were going to be a professional violence doer in very expensive clothing. The misery started early. Around age 7, when modern kids are learning to read or playing with Legos, the future knight was packed up and shipped off. Your parents would pack you a small bag of tunics and send you to another noble household. Usually, this was an uncle or a family friend who owed your dad a favor and almost immediately regretted cashing it in. This stage was called being a page. It sounds noble in fantasy novels. In reality, it was basically being a highly trained servant who also had to learn Latin. You were a glorified intern, and the pay was 0 gold pieces an hour. You spent your days serving food to adults who ignored you, cleaning armor that wasn't yours, and learning basic manners. Because nothing says future killing machine like knowing which spoon to use for the potage. You had to learn how to carve meat properly, pour wine without spilling it on the Lord's expensive tapestry, and stand quietly in corners for hours on end. You also started learning the physical stuff. You learned to ride horses. Not the cool, giant war horses yet. Those would have trampled a 7-year-old flat without even noticing. You were probably put on a very tired pony that hated you and wanted nothing more than to rub you off against a tree. It was 7 years of fetch and carry. You were constantly being yelled at by the squires, who were older teenagers and therefore naturally inclined to be jerks to the smaller kids. It was a very glamorous childhood. Eventually, if you didn't die of a random medieval childhood illness, which was a solid 50-50 toss-up right there, or get kicked in the head by the grumpy pony, you graduated. Around age 14, you became a squire. This is where things got physically unpleasant. You were attached to a full knight. Your job was basically to do everything for him so he could focus on looking stoic and heroic. You looked after his horses. Plural. Because knights needed backup horses when the first one inevitably collapsed from carrying an armored man, or just went lame from walking on bad roads. You cleaned the stables every single day. Shoveling manure was a core requirement for knighthood. You polished the armor. We'll talk about the rust later, but just know there was always rust. If it rained, rust. If the knights sweat too much, rust. If you looked at it wrong, rust. You spent hours rubbing metal with sand and vinegar until your fingers bled. You also had to help him get dressed. This wasn't like helping your buddy with a zipper. This was an hour-long ordeal of tying complicated little strings called points, and strapping heavy metal plates onto a grumpy man who probably had a hangover from the feast the night before. The knight would stand there, arms out, complaining that the breastplate was pinching his gut, while you frantically tried to tighten buckles that were stiff with cold oil. If you didn't get it right, the armor might shift during a ride and chafe his skin raw. Guess whose fault that would be? Yours. And of course, you had to train yourself. The knight was supposed to teach you, but he was usually busy doing knight stuff, which mostly involved hunting or arguing about land borders with his neighbors. So you trained with other squires. You practiced with wooden swords called wasters. They were weighted with lead to make them heavier than real swords, because why not make it harder? They didn't have sharp edges, but they were still heavy sticks of wood. Getting whack in the ribs with one of those would leave a bruise that lasted for a month. You had to exercise in chainmail to get used to the weight. It was like wearing a very heavy, very long sweater made of thousands of little metal rings that pinched your skin and pulled your arm hair every time you moved. You'd run drills in the castle courtyard, sweating profusely inside the metal rings, trying not to pass out in the summer heat. It was exhausting work. You were up before dawn to feed the horses, and you were the last one to bed after cleaning up the night's gear. You were basically a very tired personal assistant who also had to know how to use a lance. And let's not forget the financial aspect. Your dad wasn't just sending you away for free babysitting back when you were a page. He had to pay for the privilege of having you overworked in someone else's castle. Being noble was expensive. Being a noble who wanted their kid to be a knight was ruinously expensive. It's a theme we'll come back to a lot tonight. The crushing debt of chivalry. So you're 21? You've survived 14 years of servitude. You're constantly tired, your knees already hurt from squatting in chainmail, and you know exactly how hard it is to scrub horse manure off a fine leather boot. You are ready. It's time for the dubbing ceremony, which sounds fun, like a graduation party. But it was mostly just another long, uncomfortable ordeal involving an all-night vigil. You had to stay awake all night in a cold chapel, kneeling and praying over your armor. Because if you fell asleep, God would apparently be very disappointed in your ability to hit things with swords. Then in the morning, tired and stiff, you got tapped on the shoulder with a sword. Congratulations. You are now a knight. Your life is about to get significantly more expensive and uncomfortable. Let's float over to the reality of your new wardrobe. The walking ovens. So, you are officially a knight. You have the title, you have the sword, and hopefully, you have a very patient horse. Now we have to talk about the uniform. Because if you thought modern business casual was tricky to navigate, wait until you try to navigate a suit of Milanese plate armor. We tend to think of armor as this cool, empowering exoskeleton. Like medieval Iron Man. You put it on, you feel invincible, you go clank 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 down the hallway scaring the peasants. But the reality of wearing full harness was mostly just an exercise in sensory deprivation and heat management. First, let's talk about the cost. Before you even put the armor on, it hurt you. Specifically, it hurt your wallet. A full suit of custom plate armor in the late medieval period could cost as much as a large farm or a substantial townhouse. It was the equivalent of wearing a luxury sedan on your body. And just like a luxury car, if you scratched it, you cried. If you couldn't afford the good stuff, the heat-treated steel from Italy or Germany, you had to settle for local iron, which was heavier, softer, and rusted if someone even whispered the word rain nearby. So you were walking around in a suit made of second-rate metal that offered slightly less protection than a sturdy door, hoping nobody noticed you were wearing the medieval equivalent of a knockoff designer handbag. But let's assume you were rich. You had the good stuff. Let's get you dressed. You couldn't just throw on the metal. Metal on skin is a terrible idea. It pinches, it chafes, and when it gets cold, it sucks the heat right out of your bones. So you started with the underwear. A linen shirt and linen braids, which were baggy, diaper-like shorts. Very dignified. Then came the padding. This was the gambeson or the arming doublet. Imagine a heavy quilt. Now imagine stuffing that quilt with wool, horsehair, or cotton until it's about an inch thick. Now sew it into a tight-fitting jacket. That is your base layer. It was designed to absorb the shock of a blow so your ribs wouldn't shatter inside the metal shell. It was very effective at that. It was also very effective at being a portable sauna. You put this thick, padded jacket on, and immediately, your body temperature started to rise. And you haven't even touched the metal yet. On top of the padding, depending on the century, you might have mail, chain mail. A hauberk. This was a shirt made of thousands of riveted iron rings. It weighed about 20 to 30 pounds. And unlike plate armor, which distributes weight over your body, mail hangs entirely from your shoulders. So, within 10 minutes of putting it on, your traps are burning, your lower back is complaining, and you feel like you're carrying a toddler on your shoulders who refuses to get down. Then, finally, the plate. The harness. This wasn't one piece. It was a jigsaw puzzle of steel plates. Cuisses for the thighs, polions for the knees, greaves for the shins, sabatons for the feet. Every single piece had to be tied onto your arming doublet with little leather laces called points. If you were lucky, your squire knew what he was doing. If he tied a point too tight, you lost circulation in your arm. If he tied it too loose, your elbow armor would slide down to your wrist in the middle of a wave, making you look ridiculous. Once you were fully encased, you were carrying about 60 pounds of gear. Now, contrary to popular belief, you could move. You could run, jump, even do a somersault if you really felt the need to show off. The armor was articulated. It moved with you. But just because you could move didn't mean you wanted to. Every movement required more energy. Walking required more effort. Breathing required more effort because the breastplate constricted your chest expansion. You were basically doing low-intensity cardio just by standing there looking heroic. And then there was the heat. This was the true enemy of the night. Not dragons, not wizards, not even the French. It was the sun. You are wearing linen, thick wool padding, and a steel shell. You are a baked potato wrapped in foil. On a sunny day in July, the temperature inside a suit of armor could easily reach levels that would cook a literal egg. Knights passed out from heat stroke all the time. It wasn't uncommon for knights to die of heart failure without ever being touched by a weapon, just because they were boiling in their own sweat while waiting for the battle to start. It was moist in there. Just incredibly damp. You would sweat, and the sweat had nowhere to go. It soaked into the padding, which got heavier and smellier. Since you couldn't exactly toss your gambeson in the washing machine, it just sort of fermented. Old sweat, horse smell, oil from the armor, and the metallic tang of rust. A group of knights didn't smell like chivalry. They smelled like a locker room that hadn't been cleaned since the Crusades. Now, let's float over to the helmet. The thing that protects your head but ruins your day. Helmets varied, but let's talk about the classics. The great helm, or the later bassinet with a visor. Putting on a helmet is an act of trust. You are shutting yourself inside a dark metal box. Your vision is immediately reduced to a tiny slit. This is called the ocularium, which sounds scientific, but it's basically just a gap in the steel about the width of a coin. You have no peripheral vision. You can see what is directly in front of you, and that's it. If someone walks up beside you, they might as well be invisible. You spend half your time turning your entire head like a confused owl just to keep track of your friends. And the breathing. Oh, the breathing. You are breathing into a metal cup. The air doesn't circulate well. You are rebreathing your own carbon dioxide. It gets hot and stale very quickly. If you run or fight, you start gasping for air, but the helmet limits how much fresh oxygen you can actually get. It's claustrophobic. Many knights would keep their visors up until the very last second, risking an arrow to the face just so they could breathe fresh air for one more minute. And the noise. Inside a helmet, your own breathing sounds like a wind tunnel. Your voice sounds muffled and weird. And if someone hits you on the head? It's like being inside a church bell when the monk rings it for Sunday service. Even a light tap on the helmet rings in your ears. A heavy blow could concuss you without even denting the metal, just from the sheer vibration rattling your brain. So you're hot, you can't see, you can't hear well, and you're carrying an extra person's worth of weight. Now imagine you have an itch. This is a specific kind of torture. You have an itch on your nose. But your hands are in steel gauntlets. You can't fit your finger through the visor. You can't take the helmet off quickly because it's strapped to your chin. So you just have to live with it. You have to stand there, looking stoic and noble, while internally screaming because a single bead of sweat is slowly trickling down your nose and you can do absolutely nothing about it. Then there is the issue of bathroom breaks. This is the part the songs always leave out. King Arthur never had to pause the quest for the Holy Grail to find a bush. But real knights did. Getting out of armor took time. You needed a squire to help you unbuckle things. It wasn't a quick process. If you had to go, you had to plan ahead. Like 20 minutes ahead. But sometimes, nature calls at inconvenient times. Like during a battle. Or during a 10-hour march in the rain. What did they do? Well, they just went. In the armor. It happened. It was gross. It ran down the legs, soaked into the expensive padding, and eventually into the boots. Remember the Battle of Agincourt? Famous English victory. A lot of those English knights and archers were suffering from dysentery at the time. I won't paint you a picture, but let's just say that glorious combat involved a lot less shining silver and a lot more ruined trousers than the history books usually admit. So, you're encased in your expensive, sweaty, claustrophobic metal shell. You are finally ready to ride. But you can't just walk to the battlefield. That's for peasants. You need a horse. But not just any horse. You need a destrier. A regular riding horse, a palfrey, was nice and smooth. A destrier was a tank made of meat. They were bred to be aggressive, large, and strong enough to carry a fully armored man. They were expensive. A good warhorse costs more than the armor. And they were high maintenance. These horses were essentially elite athletes with anger management issues. They had to be fed specific diets of high-quality grain, or they'd lose muscle. They had to be groomed constantly. And they had to be trained not to run away when people started screaming and banging swords together. You, the knight, had to pay for all of this. You had to buy the horse, feed the horse, pay the squire to clean up after the horse, and buy armor for the horse. Yes, horse armor. Because if your horse dies, you are just a slow, heavy man in a can on the ground. So you bought chain mail or leather barding for your steed. This meant your travel logistics were a nightmare. When a knight went on campaign, he didn't just hop on his horse and go. He brought a train of luggage. He had a riding horse for travel, a war horse for fighting, which was led by a squire so it wouldn't get tired, maybe a pack mule for his tent and supplies, and servants to manage it all. It was like moving house every time you went anywhere. You were a walking, riding corporation of one, bleeding money with every step. And let's be honest, half the time, the armor didn't even work the way you wanted it to. By the late medieval period, crossbows and longbows were powerful enough to punch through plate if they hit it squarely. And then gunpowder showed up. Imagine spending the modern equivalent of $50,000 on a suit of armor, sweating in it for 3 years, training daily, only to have some peasant with a hand cannon blow a hole in your breastplate from 50 yards away. It felt unfair. It felt unsportsmanlike. The older knights complained about it constantly. In my day, we hit each other with sticks like gentlemen, they'd grumble, while nursing a bruise from a musket ball. So you're dressed, you're broke, you're hot, and you're riding a horse that costs more than your house. Surely, the fighting part makes it all worthwhile? Surely the glory of combat is where it pays off. Well, not exactly. Because combat was actually the smallest part of the job. Most of being a knight wasn't fighting. It was waiting. Let's drift over to the exciting world of garrison duty and patrolling borders, where the greatest enemy wasn't a dragon, but pure, unadulterated boredom. The boredom and the bellyaches. So we have established that you are hot, uncomfortable, and financially insolvent. But at least you get to fight, right? You get to charge across a green field with a banner snapping in the wind, clashing steel with a worthy opponent, while a bard composes a song about your jawline. Well, no. Not really. If you look at the schedule of a medieval knight, about 1% of it was actual fighting. Maybe 2% if you were really unlucky and lived during a particularly aggressive decade. The other 98% was camping. Bad camping. Camping without waterproof tents, air mattresses, or cooler boxes full of iced beverages. It was camping with 3,000 other men who haven't showered in 6 weeks, in a field that has slowly turned into a latrine. Warfare in the Middle Ages wasn't about big, cinematic battles. Those were actually rare. Generals hated big battles. They were risky. You could lose your whole army in an afternoon because the wind changed or the sun got in your eyes. It was much safer, and much more common, to engage in siege warfare. A siege is basically a very aggressive staring contest. You march your army up to a castle. The guy inside pulls up the drawbridge and locks the door. And then you sit there. You wait. You wait for them to run out of food, or water, or hope. This could take months. Sometimes years. So your life as a knight became a routine of waking up in a damp tent, putting on your damp clothes, walking through the mud to look at a stone wall, and then walking back to your tent to eat something gray. You spent hours checking the perimeter. You supervised the digging of ditches. You watched carpenters build trebuchets, which was mildly interesting for the first day and incredibly boring for the next 40. And you were hungry. Always hungry. Logistics were a nightmare. Feeding an army on the move was almost impossible. There were no supply trucks. You had to forage, which is a polite word for stealing food from the local peasants. But once you'd eaten all the chickens within a 10-mile radius, things got bleak. The staple of the military diet was something called biscuit, or hardtack. It was flour and water, baked until it was hard enough to use as a building material. It wasn't bread. It was a caloric brick. To eat it, you had to soak it in water or wine for 20 minutes just to soften it enough so it wouldn't shatter your teeth. And since the flour was often stored in sacks that weren't exactly sealed, the hardtack usually came with extra protein in the form of weevils. Maggots were a common garnish. You learned to tap the biscuit on the table to knock the bugs out before you took a bite. Or if you were hungry enough, you just didn't look. Then there was the meat. Usually salted pork or beef that had been preserved so thoroughly it tasted like a salt lick. It was tough, stringy, and incredibly thirsty work to eat. And you washed it down with ale or wine. Not because you were partying, but because the water would kill you. Everyone knew that drinking water from a stream near an army camp was a death sentence. The latrine pits were never quite far enough away from the water source. Dysentery was the #1 killer of knights. It killed more kings and nobles than swords ever did. King John of England? Dysentery. King Henry V, the hero of Agincourt? Dysentery. Edward the Black Prince? Probably dysentery or something similar. It was an unglamorous way to go. You're supposed to die gloriously on the field of honor, but instead, you die shivering in a tent, severely dehydrated, while your squire awkwardly tries to keep you clean. It's hard to look heroic when you can't control your own bowels. So you sat in the mud, eating level bread, waiting for the guys in the castle to surrender. Sometimes, just to spice things up, you would do a chevauchée. This is a fancy French word that sounds elegant, like a dance step. It actually means riding through the countryside burning everything down. This was strategic. You wanted to destroy the enemy lord's economic base. So you burned villages, destroyed mills, and trampled crops. For a knight, who was supposed to be the protector of the weak and the upholder of justice, this was morally flexible. You spent your days terrorizing unarmed farmers. It wasn't exactly the stuff of legends. You'd ride into a village, steal the cows, set fire to the thatched roofs, and ride away. It was brutal, messy work. And it was also where you made your money. Remember that massive debt you incurred buying your armor and horse? This was how you paid it off. Plunder. You weren't looking for the Holy Grail. You were looking for silverware. You were looking for candlesticks, jewelry, nice fabric, bags of coins, or even high-quality tools. Anything not nailed down went into the saddlebags. War was a business. If you were a knight, you were a mercenary with a title. You expected to make a profit. If the campaign went on too long and there wasn't enough loot, knights would threaten to go home. There was actually a strict limit on how long you had to work. The feudal levy usually required a knight to serve for 40 days a year. Just 40 days. Imagine if a modern soldier just clocked out after 6 weeks. Sorry, General, my 40 days are up. I have a harvest to supervise back home. Good luck with the siege. Kings hated this. They constantly had to bribe knights to stay longer, or pay them, scutage, shield money, to hire professional mercenaries who wouldn't quit halfway through a war. But let's say you actually got into a battle. The waiting is over. The horns blow. You lower your visor. This is it. The moment of truth. You charge. And immediately it's chaos. You can't hear orders. You can't see much. You're just trying to stay on your horse. If you fall off, you are in trouble. You're a turtle on its back. If you fall in the mud, the suction can be so strong that you can't get up. Knights actually drowned in mud. At the Battle of Agincourt, many French knights suffocated because they fell into the deep mud and other people fell on top of them. They weren't stabbed. They were just crushed in a slow, muddy pile-up. But let's assume you stay upright. You find an enemy knight. You fight. Now, here is the secret of medieval combat. You didn't really want to kill the other guy. I mean, if he was a peasant or an archer, sure, skewer him. Who cares? He's worthless. But if he was a knight? If he was wearing fancy armor and had a coat of arms? You wanted to capture him. A dead knight is just a heavy corpse. A live knight is a walking lottery ticket. Ransom was the heartbeat of medieval warfare. If you captured a wealthy knight, you could demand a fortune from his family to let him go. We're talking amounts that could set you up for life. So combat was often a weird attempt to bludgeon the other guy into submission without actually breaking him too badly. You'd hit him with a mace until he got dizzy and fell over, then you'd sit on him and pull a dagger out. You'd hold the dagger to the slit in his visor and ask, "Do you yield?" And he would usually say, "Yes, absolutely, please get off me." Then you became best friends. Sort of. You would take his sword. You would protect him. You would escort him back to your tent. He was now your honored prisoner. You gave him wine. You shared your food with him. You treated him like a guest. Why? Because he was an asset. You don't damage the merchandise. He would write a letter to his dad or his king saying, "Hey, I got caught by Sir William. He's a nice guy. Please send 5,000 gold crowns." While you waited for the money, you hung out. You played dice. You complained about the weather. You compared armor. It was a very gentlemanly business transaction. Of course, if you were the one who got captured, it sucked. Because now your family had to sell land or melt down the silverware to buy you back. Many noble families went bankrupt paying ransoms for their incompetent sons who kept getting caught. King Richard the Lionheart got captured on his way home from the Crusades. His ransom was 150,000 marks. That was 2 to 3 times the annual income of the entire English crown. England basically had to tax everyone into poverty just to get their king back so he could go start another war. So, warfare was a mix of boredom, diarrhea, looting farms, and kidnapping your coworkers for money. But surely, when you weren't at war, life was better? Surely the castle life was full of feasts, romance, and courtly love. Let's drift back from the battlefield to the castle. Let's talk about your home life. Because if you think your apartment has issues, wait until you hear about the drafty, smelly, privacy-free existence of a medieval castle. Castles were not designed for comfort. They were designed to stop people from killing you. Those two design philosophies rarely overlap. First of all, it was dark. Windows were basically arrow slits. They let in a tiny beam of light and a massive draft of cold air. Glass was rare and expensive until the later periods, so you had wooden shutters. If you wanted light, you opened the shutter and froze. If you wanted warmth, you closed the shutter and sat in the dark. It was damp. Stone walls sweat. The tapestries you see in museums weren't just for decoration, they were insulation. They tried to keep the cold from radiating off the stone and sucking the heat out of the room. They mostly failed. And it was smoky. Fireplaces were inefficient. The Great Hall, where everyone hung out, usually had a central hearth with a hole in the roof in the earlier days. The smoke was supposed to go up. Usually it just hovered at eye level, stinging your eyes and making everyone cough. And the privacy, oh, the privacy. There wasn't any. The concept of a private bedroom was a luxury for the ultra-rich, and even then, it wasn't private. As a knight, you likely slept in the Great Hall with everyone else. You'd put a pallet on the floor, wrap yourself in your cloak, and sleep next to the servants, the dogs, and 20 other snoring knights. If you were a lord with your own chamber, you still weren't alone. Your servants slept at the foot of your bed. Your bodyguards slept by the door. You dressed, undressed, and slept in front of an audience. And then there was the smell. We keep coming back to the smell, but it's important. Castles were crowded. People, horses, livestock, and dogs all lived within the walls. The rushes on the floor, dried reeds used as a carpet, were changed, occasionally. They trapped food scraps, dog poop, spilled ale, and fleas. Erasmus, a scholar who visited England later on, described the floors as harboring expectorations, vomit, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not to be mentioned. So, you're living in a dark, smoky, smelly stone box, sleeping on the floor with your co-workers. But at least there's romance, right? The Psalms tell us about courtly love. A knight dedicating his life to a beautiful lady, wearing her favor, fighting for her honor. Let's float over to the complicated, often frustrating reality of medieval dating. Because just like everything else, it was mostly a business deal with a lot of rules. You see, knights didn't usually marry for love. That was for peasants who had nothing to lose. Knights had land. Knights had titles. Marriage was a merger and acquisition strategy. Your dad probably picked your wife when you were both 7. You met her once at the betrothal, then didn't see her again until the wedding. She brought a dowry, land, money, or cows. You brought the protection and the status. Courtly love was the antidote to this boring reality. It was a game. A knight would choose a lady, usually a lady who was already married to someone else, often his boss's wife, and serve her. It wasn't supposed to be physical. It was emotional. You wrote her bad poetry. You sighed a lot. You wore her scarf at a tournament. You looked sad and pining. It was essentially a socially sanctioned emotional affair. And it was exhausting. You had to memorize poems. You had to learn to play the lute. You had to follow a strict code of behavior that involved a lot of suffering and silence. If you were a knight who just wanted to relax, this was a nightmare. You couldn't just say, "Hey, nice dress." You had to compose a sonnet comparing her eyes to the stars and her skin to milk, while ignoring the fact that she probably hadn't bathed in a week and had bad teeth. Because dental hygiene, well, let's just say the handsome knight smile was rare. Sugar was a luxury, so the rich actually had worse teeth than the poor because they could afford sweets. Queen Elizabeth I, much later, had black teeth. It was a status symbol. So imagine pining for a lady with rotting teeth in a smoky room, while you itch from lice under your velvet doublet. It's romantic, isn't it? Let's drift a little deeper into the social minefield. Because being a knight wasn't just about war and romance. It was about politics. And medieval politics made Game of Thrones look organized. You had to pick a side. And you usually picked the wrong one. The feudal system was a pyramid scheme of loyalty. You owed loyalty to your liege lord. He owed loyalty to a duke. The duke owed loyalty to the king. But what happens when the duke gets mad at the king? Your lord says, "Grab your sword, we're rebelling." You say, "But I like the king. And the king has a bigger army." Your lord says, "I don't care. If you don't come, I'll take your land and kick you out." So you go. You rebel. And then the king wins. He executes your lord. And you? You're now a landless, traitorous knight. Or maybe the king dies, and there are 2 guys claiming to be the new king. This happened all the time. The War of the Roses? Just 30 years of English knights trying to figure out which cousin they were supposed to be fighting for this week. You could fight for the red rose on Tuesday, get captured, and be fighting for the white rose by Friday. It was confusing. It was dangerous. And if you backed the loser, your head ended up on a spike above London Bridge. The birds would peck at it. It was a bad retirement plan. Speaking of retirement, let's float over to what happened when a knight got old. Assuming you survived the dysentery, the heat stroke, the arrows, the horse kicks, and the treacherous politics. What did an old knight do? He couldn't fight anymore. His joints were shot from wearing armor. His old wounds ached when it rained. He was probably deaf from the noise of battle. He had a few options. He could stay at home and annoy his children, telling stories about how much better the wars were back in his day. The trebuchets were bigger then, and the mud was deeper. Or if he wanted to save his soul, because he had done a lot of stabbing and looting, he might join a monastery. This was a popular golden parachute. You donated your land to the church, and they gave you a nice cell and 3 meals a day. You traded your sword for a prayer book. It was a quiet end. You spent your final years mumbling Latin, trying to atone for that time you burned down a convent during a chevauchee because you were in a bad mood. But before we put you in the monastery, let's talk about the specific, weird little hazards of daily life that could take you out. Because sometimes it wasn't the war or the plague. Sometimes it was just medieval fashion. Let's talk about shoes. Pointy shoes and pointless deaths. So let's talk about shoes. Specifically, the pelaine. You might think that a warrior class, men who spent their lives training for combat, would favor practical footwear. Something with grip. Something with ankle support. Something that allowed you to run away if a large angry man with an axe was chasing you. But no. In the late 14th century, the height of knightly fashion was a shoe with a toe so long it had to be stuffed with moss to keep its shape. We are talking about toes that extended 6, 12, sometimes 24 inches beyond the foot. They looked like elf shoes, if the elves were trying to compensate for something. These shoes were a disaster. You couldn't walk upstairs without tripping. You couldn't kneel in church without the toes poking the person in front of you. Some knights had to use little gold chains to tie the tips of their toes to their knees just so they could walk without falling on their faces. But they wore them. Why? Because they were useless. That was the point. If you were wearing shoes that made physical labor impossible, it proved you didn't have to do physical labor. It was a status symbol that shouted, "I am rich enough to be completely incapacitated by my own wardrobe." There is a story from the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. A crusade against the Ottoman Empire. The French knights, the cream of the crop, arrived wearing their fashionable polaines. When the battle turned against them, which it did, very quickly, and they had to dismount and run, they couldn't. They were tripping over their own feet. The chroniclers say the knights had to pause, in the middle of a battlefield, to cut the tips off their expensive shoes with their swords just so they could run away effectively. Imagine that. You've trained for years, you've traveled thousands of miles, and you almost died because you insisted on wearing clown shoes to a war zone. But fashion wasn't the only way a knight could injure himself for no good reason. Let's float over to the tournament. The tournament was the medieval equivalent of professional sports, but with live ammunition. It was where you went to show off, win money, and impress the ladies. It was supposed to be practice for war. In reality, it was often more dangerous than war. In a real war, you are cautious. In a tournament, everyone is watching. You have to take risks. There were 2 main events. The joust, which everyone knows, and the melee, which was basically a riot with rules. In the melee, they would split the knights into 2 teams, release them into a field, and tell them to go nuts. It was absolute chaos. It wasn't one-on-one duel. It was a gang fight. People got trampled. People got their arms broken. People got, accidentally, stabbed by rivals who held a grudge from a property dispute 10 years ago. And the joust. 2 men riding horses at 20 miles per hour, aiming heavy wooden lances at each other's heads. The physics of this are terrifying. When the lance hits, the impact is like getting hit by a small car. Even with armor, the shockwave travels through your body. It snaps necks. It shatters collarbones. It concusses brains inside those metal helmets. King Henry II of France died in a joust. He was wearing the best armor money could buy. But a splinter from his opponent's lance broke off, flew through the visor of his helmet, and went into his eye and brain. He didn't die immediately. He lingered for weeks in agony while the best doctors in Europe tried to figure out what to do. We'll get to the doctors in a minute. It's not a happy story. But the real pain of the tournament wasn't the broken bones. It was, once again, the financial ruin. If you lost a joust, you didn't just lose the match. You often lost your horse and your armor to the winner. You had to buy them back. So you could enter a tournament hoping to win a fortune, get knocked off your horse in the first round, and wake up with a headache and a debt that would take your family 3 generations to pay off. There were tourney bums, knights who went from town to town, losing everything, slowly sliding into poverty, sleeping in stables, holding on to their title but owning nothing but a rusty sword. It was a gambling addiction, but the dice were your own ribs. Now let's assume you survived the shoes, the wars, and the tournaments. But eventually you got hurt. You took an arrow to the leg, or you got a fever, or you just ate some bad pork. It is time to visit the medieval doctor. If you want to relax, maybe cover your ears for a moment. Because medieval medicine was a horror show performed by well-meaning people with zero understanding of germs. The first thing to understand is that doctors believed your body was a bag of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These were the humors. If you were sick, it meant your juice was out of balance. The solution to almost everything was to let some of the juice out. Bloodletting. It was the aspirin of the Middle Ages. Headache? Bleed him. Fever? Bleed him. Stab wound? He's lost a lot of blood, so we should probably bleed him some more to balance it out. They would cut a vein in your arm, or use leeches. Leeches were expensive, by the way. A good leech was a medical device. If you were a knight, you didn't go to a common barber surgeon. You had a physician. A university-educated man who knew astrology. Because obviously, you can't treat a broken leg without knowing where Jupiter is in the sky. He would diagnose you by looking at your urine. He would hold a flask of your urine up to the light, swirl it around, maybe even taste it. Yes, taste it. To check for sweetness. That was the diabetes test. Let's say you had a wound. An arrow wound. Taking an arrow out is hard. If the arrowhead is barbed, you can't pull it out. It tears the flesh. You have to push it through, or cut it out. There was no anesthesia. None. They might give you some strong wine mixed with herbs like mandrake or hemlock. If they gave you too much hemlock, you stopped breathing and died. If they gave you too little, you felt everything. Imagine lying on a wooden table, biting on a leather strap, while a man with dirty hands and a pair of iron tongs digs around in your shoulder. He doesn't wash his hands between patients. He just wiped them on his apron. The same apron he wore while lancing a boil on the previous guy. Infection was the real killer. They called it sepsis or gangrene. They didn't know what caused it. They thought it was bad air or miasma. If a wound went bad, it smelled sweet and rotten. The flesh turned black. The only cure was amputation. And again, no anesthesia. Just a saw, a knife, and a hot iron to cauterize the stump. Cauterization. The act of sealing a wound by burning it with red-hot metal. It stopped the bleeding. It also hurt more than the injury itself. The smell of burning flesh would fill the tent. It was trauma on top of trauma. There is a famous story about the future King Henry V of England. When he was a prince, he took an arrow to the face at the Battle of Shrewsbury. It went in under his eye and lodged 6 inches deep in the back of his skull. Most people would have died. But Henry was royalty. So they called the best surgeon in London, a guy named John Bradmore. Bradmore invented a tool just for this. A pair of metal tongs that he inserted into the wound, expanded inside the arrowhead, and slowly screwed into the metal. Then, over the course of several days, he wiggled the arrow out. Without anesthesia. Then he poured honey and wine into the hole to clean it. Surprisingly, honey is a natural antiseptic. It actually worked. Henry survived, though he had a gnarly scar and probably a very bad temper for the rest of his life. But most knights weren't Prince Henry. Most knights got a poultice made of weird ingredients. Doctors used things like crushed beetles, moss from a skull, or moldy bread. Sometimes, by pure accident, the moldy bread acted like primitive penicillin. Usually, it just added more bacteria to the party. And let's not forget the dental situation. If you had a toothache, you were in trouble. They believed toothaches were caused by a tooth worm that lived inside the tooth and ate the nerve. The treatment? They might try to smoke the worm out by having you inhale fumes from burning henbane seeds. This just made you high and dizzy. Or they would pull it with pliers. The village blacksmith often doubled as the dentist because he had the strongest arm and the biggest pliers. So, picture yourself. You are 40 years old. You have no teeth on the left side. Your knee clicks because of that time a horse fell on you. You have a massive scar from a cauterized arrow wound that aches when it's cold. You are deeply in debt. And you are constantly afraid of hell. Let's float over to the spiritual anxiety of the night. Because this was a big part of the job description. You lived in a society that was incredibly religious. The church was everywhere. And the church had a very specific rule. Thou shalt not kill. But your job, literally your only skill, was killing. This created a massive psychological conflict. Every time you went to war, you were sinning. Every time you killed a peasant in a raid, you were risking eternal damnation. Knights were terrified of hell. They spent their lives hurting people, and their nights worrying about the demons that were waiting for them. The church, being clever, found a solution. The Crusades. Hey, the Pope said. Killing Christians is bad. But killing non-Christians? That's actually good. In fact, if you go do that, we'll wipe your slate clean. This was a huge selling point. The plenary indulgence. It was a get out of hell free card. So thousands of knights sold their land, mortgaged their castles, and rode off to the Holy Land. Not just for gold, but because they were genuinely terrified for their souls. They wanted to wash away the guilt of a lifetime of violence with more violence. It was a weird logic, but it made sense at the time. But the Crusades were just a hotter, dustier, further away version of the misery we've already discussed. You marched through deserts in chain mail. You died of thirst. You died of strange fevers. You got captured and held for ransom in a country where nobody spoke your language. And if you came back, you were usually broke. Your neighbors had probably encroached on your land while you were gone. Your wife might have thought you were dead and remarried. You were a stranger in your own home, traumatized by things you couldn't explain. It was medieval PTSD. They didn't have a name for it. They just said you were melancholy, or had a heavy heart. They would prescribe herbs, or tell you to pray more. But you can't pray away the sound of a battlefield. So you sat by the fire in your drafty castle, rubbing your aching joints, looking at your rust-spotted armor hanging on the wall. You were a hero. The bards sang songs about glory. But you knew the truth. The truth was that being a knight was a job. A dirty, painful, expensive job. You were a tool of the state, a landlord struggling to pay the bills, and a man trying to survive in a world that wanted to kill you with everything from a lance to a pair of pointy shoes. But surely, there must have been some good moments? Some perks of the job? Well, let's float over to the food. The feasts. The one time you actually got to enjoy being the 1%. Surely the dining experience was magnificent? Prepare yourself for a lot of jelly. The indigestible feast, and the end of the road. So, we have arrived at dinner. After a long day of sweating in iron, getting yelled at by your lord, and dodging dysentery, you are finally ready to eat. And in the movies, the medieval feast looks amazing. Great wooden tables groaning under the weight of roasted boars, goblets of wine, and people laughing while throwing chicken bones over their shoulders. The reality, as you might expect by now, was a bit more complicated. And a lot more gelatinous. First, let's talk about the plates. You didn't really have them. Not in the way you think. You had a trencher. A trencher was a thick slice of bread. But not good bread. It was stale, coarse, whole wheat bread that had been left out for a few days until it was hard enough to be used as a construction material. This was your plate. The servers would pile meat and sauce directly onto the bread. The bread would soak up the grease and the juices. It acted as an edible sponge. If you were very hungry, you ate the trencher at the end of the meal. But usually, by the time you got to it, it was a soggy, disintegrating mess of gravy and knife marks. So, the polite thing to do was to leave it. It would be collected and given to the poor or to the dogs. It was trickle-down economics, but with soggy bread. Now, the seating. This was stressful. You couldn't just sit anywhere. The entire table was a map of social hierarchy. The most important object on the table was the salt cellar. Salt was expensive. So the giant, ornate salt shaker sat in the middle of the high table. Or they would pull it. With pliers. The village blacksmith often doubled as the dentist because he had the strongest arm and the biggest pliers. So, picture yourself. You are 40 years old. You have no teeth on the left side. Your knee clicks because of that time a horse fell on you. You have a massive scar from a cauterized arrow wound that aches when it's cold. You are deeply in debt. And you are constantly afraid of hell. Let's float over to the spiritual anxiety of the night. Because this was a big part of the job description. You lived in a society that was incredibly religious. The church was everywhere. And the church had a very specific rule. Thou shalt not kill. But your job, literally your only skill, was killing. This created a massive psychological conflict. Every time you went to war, you were sinning. Every time you killed a peasant in a raid, you were risking eternal damnation. Knights were terrified of hell. They spent their lives hurting people, and their nights worrying about the demons that were waiting for them. The church, being clever, found a solution. The Crusades. Hey, the Pope said. Killing Christians is bad. But killing non-Christians? That's actually good. In fact, if you go do that, we'll wipe your slate clean. This was a huge selling point. The plenary indulgence. It was a get out of hell free card. So thousands of knights sold their land, mortgaged their castles, and rode off to the Holy Land. Not just for gold, but because they were genuinely terrified for their souls. They wanted to wash away the guilt of a lifetime of violence with more violence. It was a weird logic, but it made sense at the time. But the Crusades were just a hotter, dustier, further away version of the misery we've already discussed. You marched through deserts in chain mail. You died of thirst. You died of strange fevers. You got captured and held for ransom in a country where nobody spoke your language. And if you came back, you were usually broke. Your neighbors had probably encroached on your land while you were gone. Your wife might have thought you were dead and remarried. You were a stranger in your own home, traumatized by things you couldn't explain. It was medieval PTSD. They didn't have a name for it. They just said you were melancholy, or had a heavy heart. They would prescribe herbs, or tell you to pray more. But you can't pray away the sound of a battlefield. So you sat by the fire in your drafty castle, rubbing your aching joints, looking at your rust-spotted armor hanging on the wall. You were a hero. The bards sang songs about glory. But you knew the truth. The truth was that being a knight was a job. A dirty, painful, expensive job. You were a tool of the state, a landlord struggling to pay the bills, and a man trying to survive in a world that wanted to kill you with everything from a lance to a pair of pointy shoes. But surely, there must have been some good moments? Some perks of the job? Well, let's float over to the food. The feasts. The one time you actually got to enjoy being the 1%. Surely the dining experience was magnificent? Prepare yourself for a lot of jelly. The indigestible feast, and the end of the road. So, we have arrived at dinner. After a long day of sweating in iron, getting yelled at by your lord, and dodging dysentery, you are finally ready to eat. And in the movies, the medieval feast looks amazing. Great wooden tables groaning under the weight of roasted boars, goblets of wine, and people laughing while throwing chicken bones over their shoulders. The reality, as you might expect by now, was a bit more complicated. And a lot more gelatinous. First, let's talk about the plates. You didn't really have them. Not in the way you think. You had a trencher. A trencher was a thick slice of bread. But not good bread. It was stale, coarse, whole wheat bread that had been left out for a few days until it was hard enough to be used as a construction material. This was your plate. The servers would pile meat and sauce directly onto the bread. The bread would soak up the grease and the juices. It acted as an edible sponge. If you were very hungry, you ate the trencher at the end of the meal. But usually, by the time you got to it, it was a soggy, disintegrating mess of gravy and knife marks. So, the polite thing to do was to leave it. It would be collected and given to the poor or to the dogs. It was trickle-down economics, but with soggy bread. Now, the seating. This was stressful. You couldn't just sit anywhere. The entire table was a map of social hierarchy. The most important object on the table was the salt cellar. Salt was expensive. So the giant, ornate salt shaker sat in the middle of the high table. The golden age of knighthood, if it ever really existed, was fading. By the 15th and 16th centuries, being a knight just didn't mean what it used to. Technology was ruining everything. We talked about the longbow. A peasant with a piece of wood could kill a great lord from a distance. That was bad enough. It was insulting. But then came the guns. Early guns were terrible. They were slow, inaccurate, and sometimes exploded in your face. But they were scary. And they were loud. And a bullet didn't care how much your Milanese armor cost. It punched right through. Suddenly, the battlefield wasn't about individual heroism. It wasn't about charging on a horse and clashing swords. It was about lines of men standing in smoke, firing volleys of lead. The horse became a liability. A big target. Armor became heavier and heavier to try and stop the bullets, until it was so heavy you couldn't walk. Bulletproof armor actually comes from this era. The armorer would shoot the breastplate with a pistol to prove it worked, leaving a dent or a proof mark. But eventually, they just gave up. Why wear 80 pounds of steel if a musket ball is going to kill you anyway? So the armor vanished. The heavy cavalry charge vanished. And the economics changed. Kings realized that for the price of one fully equipped knight, they could hire 20 guys with pikes and guns. Professional soldiers. Mercenaries. Men who followed orders, didn't have egos about their family crests, and didn't need a squire to help them put on their pants. The knight was priced out of the market. So, what happened to them? Did they disappear? No. They evolved. Or rather, they devolved. They became courtiers. If you couldn't be a warrior anymore, you became a politician. The castle became a palace. The moat was filled in and turned into a garden. The arrow slits were widened into big glass windows. The knight traded his sword for a silk handkerchief. He stopped learning how to ride a war horse and started learning how to dance the galliard. He stopped fighting for the king and started competing for the king's attention by wearing the most expensive velvet doublet and telling the wittiest jokes. The violence became symbolic. The tournament became a pageant, a scripted show with safe weapons, more like a parade than a fight. The title, Sir, remained. But the job description changed completely. Instead of managing a garrison, you managed an estate. You worried about wool prices and tenant rents. You became a landlord. A justice of the peace. A bureaucrat in a fancy hat. The chivalric code, protect the weak, fight for justice, became a nostalgic fairy tale. People wrote books about it, like Don Quixote, mocking the old guys who still thought they were heroes in a world that had moved on to gunpowder and accounting. And that is the tragedy of the medieval knight. He wasn't a superhero. He was a middle manager in a violent system. He was a man who spent his childhood being a servant, his youth being a sweaty, indebted thug, and his old age suffering from joint pain and irrelevance. He lived in a world of mud, blood, and bad smells, trying to maintain a dignity that was constantly being stripped away by rust, lice, and debt. So, the next time you see a movie with a dashing knight in shining armor, galloping effortlessly across a sunlit field, his hair flowing in the wind, just remember the reality. Remember the chafing. Remember the smell of the unwashed padding. Remember the mortgage on the horse. Remember the weevils in the bread. And remember the desperate need to find a bush while encased in a metal shell. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a grind. But hey, at least they had cool swords. That brings us to the end of our journey into the ironclad misery of the past. You can let go of the lance now. You can take off the helmet. You can stretch your legs. The war is over. The feast is done. The castle is quiet, except for the wind in the arrow slits. The family circle. Let's float away from the muddy battlefields and the drafty castles of the knights. Let's move up the social ladder. Let's go straight to the top. To the people the knights were dying for. The kings and queens. Now, we tend to think of royalty as the pinnacle of human existence. The best clothes, the best food, the best palaces. You imagine them as these elegant, powerful figures. But there was a catch to being royal. A very big, very biological catch. The problem was power. And specifically, the fear of losing it. If you were a king, you didn't want your daughter marrying just anyone. If she married a duke from a rival family, that duke might decide he wants your kingdom. So, the safest thing to do, obviously, was to have her marry someone you could trust. Someone who already had a claim to the throne. Like her cousin. Or her uncle. This is where we enter the fascinating, circular world of the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were the ultimate power dynasty of Europe. For centuries, they ruled everything. Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, parts of Italy, the Netherlands. They were the CEOs of Europe. Their motto was actually, "Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did. They married themselves. Over and over again. They treated their gene pool like a very exclusive VIP lounge where the bouncer wouldn't let anyone in unless they were already related to the DJ. The result of this strategic inbreeding was a distinctive physical trait known as the Habsburg jaw. In medical terms, it's mandibular prognathism. In non-medical terms, it meant the lower jaw grew faster than the upper jaw. It jutted out. It started off as a strong chin. A bit heroic, maybe. But as the generations went on, and the family tree started to look less like a tree and more like a tumbleweed, the chin got aggressive. It got to the point where some of the Habsburg monarchs couldn't actually close their mouths. Their bottom teeth sat inches in front of their top teeth. Chewing was a logistical challenge. They also had the Habsburg lip, a thick, protruding lower lip, and often a large, misshapen nose. If you look at the portraits in the Prado Museum, you can see the genetics collapsing in real time. The painters tried to be flattering. They used shadows and angles to hide the worst of it. But there's only so much oil paint can do against biology. But the ultimate victim of this dynastic strategy, the final, tragic punchline to centuries of keeping it in the family, was a man named Charles II of Spain. He is known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Poor Charles. He never stood a chance. He was born in 1661. His father was Philip IV of Spain. His mother was Mariana of Austria. Here is the math. Philip IV was Mariana's uncle. Mariana was Philip's niece. But it gets worse. Philip's parents were first cousins. Mariana's parents were first cousins. If you go back a few generations, everyone is just marrying each other in a loop. In a normal human being, you have 8 great-grandparents. Charles II had 4. His coefficient of inbreeding, which is a number geneticists use to measure how related your parents are, was 0.254. To give you some context, if you married your own sister, the coefficient of your child would be 0.25. So Charles was slightly more inbred than the child of a brother-sister couple, just from the sheer accumulation of generations of cousins marrying cousins. He was a genetic dead end. When he was born, the Spanish court was ecstatic. They finally had a male heir. But the celebration was muted. The ambassador from France took one look at the baby and wrote home. "The prince seems to be extremely weak. He has a herpes-type rash on his cheeks. His head is covered in scabs." 5-4. To give you some context, if you married your own sister, the coefficient of your child would be 0.25. So Charles was slightly more inbred than the child of a brother-sister couple, just from the sheer accumulation of generations of cousins marrying cousins. He was a genetic dead end. When he was born, the Spanish court was ecstatic. They finally had a male heir. But the celebration was muted. The ambassador from France took one look at the baby and wrote home. "The prince seems to be extremely weak. He has a herpes-type rash on his cheeks. His head is covered in scabs. And underneath the right ear, a kind of suppuration forms." It wasn't a great start. Charles was tiny. He was fragile. He couldn't suckle properly because his jaw was so misaligned. His tongue was too large for his mouth, so he drooled constantly. He barely spoke because he couldn't form the words. They didn't think he would survive the week. Then they didn't think he would survive the month. But somehow, Charles defied the odds. He kept living. But his life was a long, slow series of medical disasters. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. 8. Before that, he was carried everywhere by ladies-in-waiting, like a very large, very confused doll. He didn't speak a coherent sentence until he was 4 or 5. And even then, he was hard to understand. He mumbled. He had to repeat himself. Charles, who was weak and hated conflict, would just hide. He started to decline rapidly. By his 30s, Charles looked like an old man. He was bald. He had lost his teeth. He was deaf in one ear. He could barely stand up. His digestion was a disaster. He suffered from constant diarrhea and vomiting. He looked like a walking ghost. Toward the end, he became obsessed with death. But not in a philosophical way. In a literal way. He ordered the coffins of his ancestors to be opened in the royal crypt at El Escorial. He went down there. He wanted to look at them. He opened the coffin of his first wife, Marie-Louise. He looked at her remains. He touched them. He wept. It was a scene of Gothic horror. A sick, dying king communing with the dust of the only person who had ever been kind to him. Finally, in November 1700, at the age of 38, which was miraculously old for someone with his medical chart, Charles II's body gave up. He died. And with him, the Spanish Habsburg line died. Centuries of power, gold, and empire, all ending in a quiet room with a man who could barely breathe. The autopsy of Charles II is famous in medical history. The physician who performed it, Dr. Antonio Pedro Garcatarena, wrote a report that reads like pure fiction. He said the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood, which is an exaggeration, but implies severe anemia. He said his heart was the size of a peppercorn. Again, likely atrophy. He said his lungs were corroded. His intestines rotten and gangrenous. And perhaps most tellingly, he had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. It was a catalogue of total systemic failure. The man wasn't just sick, he was incompatible with life. And yet, his death caused exactly what his family had tried to prevent for 200 years. War. Because he had no heir, everyone claimed the throne. The War of the Spanish Succession broke out. It lasted 13 years. It tore Europe apart. Thousands of people died. All because the Habsburgs refused to marry outside the family circle. It's a cautionary tale, really. If you want to keep power, sometimes you have to share it. Or at least, introduce some new DNA into the mix. But the Habsburgs weren't the only ones. Oh no. The royal habit of marrying cousins was a European hobby. Let's float over to England. To a much later time. To a grandmother who loved her family very much, and accidentally gave them a terrible gift. Let's talk about Queen Victoria and the royal disease, the bleeding princes. So we leave the sunny, dusty plains of Spain and head north to the rainy, industrial bustle of 19th century England. It's a different vibe. No more medieval castles. We have steam trains. We have top hats. We have tea. And we have Queen Victoria. Victoria is the grandmother of Europe. She is a tiny, formidable woman in black silk. She rules the largest empire the world has ever seen. And she has a lot of children. 9 of them. And because she is queen, she wants her children to marry well. She marries them off to the royal houses of Germany, Russia, Spain, and beyond. She is weaving a web of alliances across the continent. She thinks she is creating peace. If all the kings are cousins, the logic went, they won't bomb each other. Spoiler alert, they definitely will bomb each other. World War I is basically a family feud that got out of hand. But Victoria passed on something else besides political alliances. She passed on a gene mutation on the X chromosome. Hemophilia B. It's a blood clotting disorder. If you have it, your blood doesn't coagulate properly. A nosebleed can last for days. A bruise isn't just a bruise, it's internal bleeding that swells up into the joints, causing agony. A simple fall from a horse, or a bump on a table, could be fatal. The tricky thing about hemophilia is that it's sex-linked. Women are usually carriers. They have 2 X chromosomes, so if one is faulty, the healthy one compensates. They don't get sick, but they pass it on. Men have 1 X and 1 Y. If they get the faulty X, they have the disease. Victoria didn't know she had it. It was likely a spontaneous mutation. Her father wasn't a hemophiliac. It just happened. A tiny glitch in the code of history. Her son, Prince Leopold, had it. He was a fragile boy. He couldn't play rough games. He had to be wrapped in cotton wool. He lived in constant pain. He eventually died at 30, after slipping and hitting his knee, which led to a brain hemorrhage. But the real impact was through Victoria's daughters. They carried the gene into the other royal families of Europe like a ticking time bomb. Princess Alice, Victoria's daughter, married into the German royalty. She passed it to her son, Friedrich, who died at age 2 after falling out of a window. A fall that should have just been a bump turned into uncontrollable bleeding. But the most famous, and most tragic, destination for this gene was Russia. Let's float east. To the winter palaces of St. Petersburg. To the Romanovs. Tsar Nicholas II was the ruler of Russia. He was a man who really just wanted to be a quiet country gentleman, but fate made him an autocrat. He married Alix of Hesse, one of Queen Victoria's granddaughters. She took the name Alexandra. She was beautiful, shy, and deeply religious. They were a true love match. They adored each other. They wrote sappy letters. They slept in the same bed, which was unusual for royals. They had 4 daughters. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia. The Otma sisters. They were healthy, happy, and wore matching white dresses. But the Tsar needed a son. A boy to inherit the throne. The law said only a male could rule. Finally, in 1904, the cannon fired. A boy was born. Alexei. There was jubilation. Church bells rang. The dynasty was saved. But a few weeks later, the doctors noticed something. When they cut the umbilical cord, it bled a little too long. When the baby bumped his arm, a dark, blue swelling appeared. The horror set in. He had the English disease. The heir to the Russian throne, the future of the empire, was a boy who could be killed by a paper cut. This secret dominated the lives of the Romanovs. They couldn't tell the public. A Tsar had to be strong, appointed by God. If people knew the heir was defective, the dynasty would look weak. So they hid it. They retreated from society. They stopped throwing balls. They moved to the Alexander Palace and lived in isolation. Alexandra became a frantic, paranoid mother. She watched Alexei like a hawk. If he wanted to run, she said no. If he wanted to play with other boys, she said no. He was surrounded by sailor nannies, big burly men whose only job was to catch him if he fell. Imagine the childhood of this boy. He was lively. He was mischievous. He wanted to slide down banisters. But he lived in a bubble of terror. When he did have a bleed, it was horrific. There was an incident at Spala, the royal hunting lodge. Alexei jumped into a boat and hit his groin against the side. A massive internal hemorrhage started. For weeks, the boy screamed in agony. The blood pooled in his abdomen, pressing on his nerves. He begged his mother to help him. He begged for death. He reportedly said, "When I am dead, it will not hurt any more, will it?" The Tsar and Tsarina sat by his bedside, helpless. The most powerful people in Russia, who commanded millions of soldiers, couldn't stop the bleeding of one small boy. Alexandra was desperate. The doctors were useless. They gave him aspirin, which, we now know, thins the blood and makes it worse. So she turned to the only person who offered hope. A wandering, smelly, unwashed mystic from Siberia. Grigory Rasputin. You've heard the song. You've seen the beard. But the reality of Rasputin was less funk machine and more spiritual predator. He was a starets, a holy man. He had piercing eyes and a hypnotic voice. He told Alexandra, "Don't worry. The little one will not die. God has heard your prayers." And weirdly, whenever Rasputin was around, Alexei got better. Historians still debate why. Maybe Rasputin calmed the mother, which calmed the boy, lowering his blood pressure. Maybe he told the doctors to stop giving him aspirin. Maybe it was just coincidence. But to Alexandra, it was a miracle. Rasputin was a saint. She gave him access to everything. He became the most powerful man in Russia. He appointed ministers. He gave advice on the war. He was a drunk, a womanizer, and totally corrupt, but the Empress wouldn't hear a word against him because he was keeping her son alive. The Russian people didn't know about hemophilia. They just saw a dirty Siberian peasant whispering in the Queen's ear. They thought they were having an affair. They thought he was a German spy. The anger against Rasputin, and by extension the Tsar, grew and grew. The aristocracy hated him. The peasants were confused by him. It destabilized the entire government. When World War I started, things got worse. The Tsar went to the front. Alexandra stayed in the capital, running the country with Rasputin. It was a disaster. In a way, Queen Victoria's gene brought down the Russian Empire. If Alexei had been healthy, Rasputin would never have gained power. If Rasputin hadn't gained power, the aristocracy might not have turned on the Tsar so viciously. Maybe the revolution happens anyway, but maybe it happens differently. It's a butterfly effect. A single microscopic mutation on an X chromosome in London traveled to St. Petersburg and helped topple a 300-year-old dynasty. Eventually, Rasputin was murdered by a group of nobles. They poisoned him, allegedly, shot him, beat him, and threw him in a river. He was very hard to kill. But it was too late. The damage was done. In 1917, the revolution came. Nicholas abdicated. He did it for Alexei. He didn't want to be separated from his sick son. The family was imprisoned. And in July 1918, in a basement in Ekaterinburg, they were all executed. The Tsar, the Tsarina, the 4 daughters, and the sickly boy Alexei. It was a brutal end to the story of the royal disease in Russia. But the gene didn't stop there. It popped up in the Spanish royal family too. Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Ana, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain. She warned him. She said, "My family has bad blood." He said, "I don't care, you're pretty and English." They got married. They had sons. 2 of them had hemophilia. The eldest son, the heir, was a bleeder. He eventually bled to death after a minor car accident. He slammed his car into a telephone booth, a crash he could have walked away from, but the internal bleeding killed him. King Alfonso never forgave his wife. He treated her like a carrier of a plague. He would stand in front of the mirror and say, "I am the last of my line." The marriage collapsed. The Spanish monarchy eventually fell, for a while. It's amazing to think about. These families were obsessed with pure blood. They were obsessed with lineage. But the blood itself was their enemy. It's a reminder that nature doesn't care about titles. It doesn't care about crowns. DNA is a ruthless editor. If you make a typo, it keeps printing it, generation after generation. So, that's the genetic tragedy of the royals. They were victims of their own exclusivity. But not every royal disaster was caused by biology. Sometimes the disaster was just personality. Sometimes a king wasn't sick. He was just weird. Or mad. Or just really, really bad at his job. Let's float over to a man who thought he was made of glass. The Glass King and the Barking Man. Let's drift to France. The late 14th century. It's the middle of the 100 Years' War. France is having a hard time, and they need a strong leader. Instead, they got Charles VI. Charles VI started well. He was handsome. He was called Charles the Beloved. Everyone liked him. But when he was 24, things took a turn. He was riding through a forest on a hot August day. He was tired. He was wearing a heavy velvet jacket. Suddenly, a man in rags jumped out of the bushes. The man grabbed the king's bridle and screamed, "Ride no further, noble king! You are betrayed!" The bodyguards chased the man away. But Charles was shaken. He rode on in silence. A few hours later, one of his pages dropped a lance. It hit a helmet with a loud clang. Charles snapped. He drew his sword. He screamed, "Forward against the traitors!" and attacked his own men. He killed 4 of his own knights before they could wrestle him to the ground. He was frothing at the mouth. His eyes were rolling back in his head. They tied him to a wagon and drove him back to Paris. He was in a coma for days. When he woke up, he seemed okay. He apologized. He gave money to the widows of the men he killed. But it was just the beginning. For the next 30 years, the King of France would cycle in and out of madness. Sometimes he would forget his own name. Sometimes he wouldn't recognize his wife and children. He would run through the corridors of the palace howling like a wolf. He developed a condition called the glass delusion. He believed he was made of glass. Literally. He thought his torso and legs were fragile glass that would shatter if he bumped into anything. He had iron rods sewn into his clothes to reinforce his glass body. He wrapped himself in thick blankets. If anyone came near him, he would scream, "Don't touch me! I'll break!" He refused to bathe. For months. He refused to change his clothes. He became covered in lice and filth. At one point, he decided he was St. George. At another point, he simply refused to acknowledge that he was king, referring to himself as George, and asking who that Charles fellow was. His wife, Queen Isabel, was terrified of him. She moved to a different bedroom. She essentially locked him in his apartments, and tried to run the country herself. But you can imagine the chaos. France was at war with England, and their king was hiding in a room, convinced he was a vase. The English king, Henry V, the guy we mentioned earlier with the arrow in his face, took full advantage. He invaded. He won Agincourt. He basically took over France because the French leadership was paralyzed by the king's episodes. Charles VI lived for a long time. Too long, really? He died in 1422, leaving France in ruins. But Charles wasn't the only eccentric. Let's look at Christian VII of Denmark. This was the 18th century. The Enlightenment. People were wearing powdered wigs and discussing philosophy. Christian was difficult. He became king at 17. He was small, pale, and clearly disturbed. He had a habit of slapping people in the face during conversations. Just whack. Then he would giggle. He loved leapfrog. He would force his ministers, dignified, elderly men in stiff coats, to play leapfrog with him in the council chamber. He would run through the streets of Copenhagen at night with a gang of friends, breaking windows and fighting with the night watchman. He was basically a royal hooligan. But his strangest quirk was his workout. In the mornings he would have battles in his bedroom. He would pile up furniture, bottles, and mirrors, and then attack them with a sword. He would smash everything to pieces, screaming war cries. Then he would emerge, sweaty and covered in glass dust, and say, "I have defeated the enemy." He also had a best friend. A dog? No. A prostitute named Stavlet Catherine of the Boots. She was known for her beautiful feet. He took her everywhere. He paraded her through the court. The ministers were horrified. They eventually paid her to leave the country. Christian got worse. He started to hallucinate. He would have long conversations with people who weren't there. The tragedy of Christian is that he was likely schizophrenic, or suffered from porphyria, the same disease that might have affected George III of England. But back then, they just thought he was unruly. They gave him a tutor, a doctor named Johann Struensee. Struensee was smart. He realized the king was easily manipulated. He started to control the king. He would say, "Sign this law, Your Majesty, and we can go break some windows later." Struensee essentially took over Denmark. He passed thousands of laws. He modernized the country. He introduced freedom of the press, abolished torture, and cleaned up the city. He also started sleeping with the Queen, Caroline Matilda, which was a bold move. Christian didn't seem to mind. He liked Struensee. Struensee was the only one who could calm him down. But the Danish nobles hated it. A German doctor sleeping with the Queen and running the country? No thanks. They staged a coup. They arrested Struensee. They woke Christian up in the middle of the night and made him sign the death warrant. Christian, confused and scared, signed it. They executed Struensee. They divorced the Queen and exiled her. And Christian? He spent the rest of his life in a room, drawing pictures of his dead friends on the walls, occasionally slapping his keepers. He remained king in name only for another 36 years. A puppet in a powdered wig. It seems to be a theme. The higher up you go, the lonelier it gets. And the more the mind starts to crack under the pressure of the crown. But there is one more category of royal weirdness we need to touch on. Not the sick, and not the mad. But the obsessive. The ones who had too much money and too much time, and decided to build things that made no sense. Let's float over to Bavaria. To the Swan King. The king who lived in a fairy tale. So, we arrive in Bavaria. It is the mid-19th century. The mountains are high, the forests are deep, and the king is, well, he is Ludwig too. Ludwig is different from the other royals we've met. He isn't inbred to the point of collapse. He isn't screaming at invisible enemies. He is just disappointed. Disappointed that reality isn't an opera. Ludwig was a romantic. He grew up reading German legends about knights, dragons, and holy grails. He wanted to be a medieval king. He wanted to be Lohengrin, the Swan Knight. Unfortunately, he was a constitutional monarch in a modernizing Germany. His job involved signing papers, meeting with ministers about railway taxes, and dealing with the Prussians. He hated it. He found it incredibly boring and unaesthetic. So, he decided to build his own reality. Ludwig is the reason we have the Disney castle. Neuschwanstein. You've seen it. It's the white castle perched on a rugged cliff, with soaring towers and turrets. It looks perfect. But it's fake. It wasn't built for defense. It was built as a stage set. Ludwig hired a theatrical set designer, Christian Jank, to design it, not an architect. That tells you everything. He didn't want a functional building, he wanted a vibe. He poured money into it. He wanted it to be a temple to his idol, the composer Richard Wagner. Ludwig was obsessed with Wagner. He paid off Wagner's massive debts, built him an opera house, and basically acted as his biggest fanba. Inside Neuschwanstein, there is an artificial cave. A grotto. With colored lights and a waterfall. On the third floor of a castle. Why? Because there was a cave in a Wagner opera, so Ludwig needed one in his house. He lived a nocturnal life. He slept all day and woke up in the evening. He hated seeing people. He would dine alone, but he insisted the table be set for 4 or 5 imaginary guests, usually dead French kings like Louis XIV or Marie Antoinette. He would have conversations with them while he ate. The servants had to bow to the empty chairs. At night, when the rest of Bavaria was sleeping, Ludwig would go for rides. He had elaborate sleighs built. Gilded Rococo sleighs with electric lights, which were brand new technology. He would dress up in medieval costumes and ride through the snowy mountains in the dead of night, stopping for picnics in the snow. The local peasants would see him passing by, a glowing, golden sleigh driven by a man in velvet, disappearing into the dark forest. They called him the Moon King. But this fairy tale was expensive. Ludwig was bleeding the treasury dry. He wasn't using state money, he was using his own allowance. But he was borrowing millions from foreign banks. He was threatening the financial stability of the royal house. And he was ignoring his job. When Prussia invaded France in 1870, Ludwig had to be pestered to send troops. He just wanted to look at blueprints for his next castle, Herrenchiemsee, which was a replica of Versailles built on an island. Eventually, the government had enough. In 1886, they decided to remove him. They couldn't just fire him. He was the king. So they declared him insane. They sent a team of psychiatrists to diagnose him. They didn't examine him personally. They just interviewed his servants, who told them about the imaginary dinners and the night sleighs. The doctors wrote a report saying he suffered from paranoia. A commission went to Neuschwanstein to arrest him. At first, Ludwig tried to fight. He summoned the local police and the fire brigade. He threatened to jump from the tower. But eventually he surrendered. He was taken to Berg Castle, on the shores of Lake Starnberg. The next day, June 13, 1886, Ludwig went for a walk by the lake with his psychiatrist, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. They never came back. That night, their bodies were found floating in shallow water near the shore. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m. It is one of history's great mysteries. The official version was suicide by drowning. But Ludwig was a strong swimmer. And the water was waist deep. And Dr. von Gudden's body showed signs of a struggle, bruises and scratches. Did Ludwig try to escape? Did he kill the doctor and then have a heart attack? Was he murdered by his enemies to stop him from reclaiming the throne? We will never know. The king who wanted to live in a legend died in a mystery. It's a sad end. He wasn't a bad man. He didn't start wars. He didn't execute people. He just wanted to build pretty things and listen to loud music. In the end, the real world just didn't have room for him. But while Ludwig's death was tragic and mysterious, most royal deaths were just dumb. Let's float over to the final chapter of our royal tour. Let's look at the times when the universe decided to humble a king in the most embarrassing way possible. The unfortunate exits. We spend a lot of time thinking about kings dying in battle. A sword to the heart. A glorious charge. But statistically, kings were much more likely to die from tripping over something. Let's take William the Conqueror. The man who conquered England. A brutal, powerful warrior. In 1087, he was at war in France. He was riding through the town of Mantes, which his soldiers had just set on fire. William was overweight at this point. Very overweight. The French king had actually made a joke about it, calling him a pregnant woman. As William rode through the burning ruins, his horse stepped on a hot coal. The horse bucked. William was thrown forward. The high pommel of his saddle slammed into his stomach. Hard. It ruptured his intestines. He didn't die immediately. He lingered for weeks in agony. But the real horror happened after he died. His funeral was a disaster. The attendants had stripped his body of all jewelry and clothes, because looting the dead king was standard practice. The monks had to scramble to find a stone coffin. But they miscalculated. The coffin was too small for William's expanded size. They tried to force him in. They pushed on his stomach. And, well, he exploded. The gas buildup in the decomposing body, combined with the pressure, caused the abdomen to burst. The smell was reportedly so bad that people ran out of the church. The priests had to rush through the rest of the service while holding their noses. From conqueror to exploding corpse. It's a humbling trajectory. Or consider Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. A legend. He led the Third Crusade. He had a massive army. He was going to retake Jerusalem. He was marching through Turkey. It was hot. They came to a river, the Salef. The army was crossing the bridge, but it was slow. Frederick was impatient. He said, "I'll just swim across." He was 70 years old. And he was wearing armor. He jumped his horse into the water. The current was stronger than it looked. The shock of the cold water, the weight of the mail, the age, he went under. He drowned in waist-deep water while his entire army watched. The crusade basically ended right there. They pickled his body in vinegar to try and bring it home, but it decomposed anyway. A massive geopolitical campaign ended because one old man didn't want to wait for the bridge. Then there is James II of Scotland. James loved cannons. He was obsessed with the new artillery technology of the 15th century. He had a favorite cannon called the Lion. He was besieging Roxburgh Castle in 1460. He wanted to fire the cannon himself to salute his queen. He stood right next to it. He lit the fuse. But cannons back then were made of iron bars welded together with hoops. They were prone to metal fatigue. The cannon didn't fire forward. It exploded outward. A shard of iron, described as being the size of a cartwheel, sliced through the king's thigh bone. He died instantly, killed by his own favorite toy. And finally, let's look at the death of King Alexander of Greece. This was 1920. Alexander was young, popular, and leading Greece during a war with Turkey. He was walking his dog, a German shepherd named Fritz, in the palace gardens. A monkey, a Barbary macaque that belonged to the steward of the palace, attacked the dog. Alexander ran in to separate them. Another monkey jumped out and bit the king on the leg and the torso. It wasn't a deep wound. They cleaned it. They didn't think much of it. But it got infected. Sepsis set in. 3 weeks later, the king of Greece died. From a monkey bite. His death changed everything. His father, Constantine, came back to the throne. Constantine made bad military decisions. Greece lost the war with Turkey. The map of the Middle East and Europe was redrawn. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. All because a monkey in a garden had a bad day. It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? We worry about grand plans and 5-year goals. But history is often just a series of accidents. A stumbling horse. A faulty cannon. A mosquito. A monkey. It makes you realize that chaos is the real ruler of the world. And on that comforting thought, I think it's time to close the history book for tonight. We've seen knights sweating in their metal shells. We've seen kings with jaws so big they couldn't chew. We've seen palaces built for ghosts, and empires brought down by bad plumbing. The past was messy. It was painful. It was often ridiculous. But it's over. You don't have to wear a corset. You don't have to worry about the Vikings. You don't have to marry your cousin. You just have to sleep. The timeline will still be here when you wake up. But for now, let it fade into the dark. Good night. The golden hamster wheel of Versailles. Actually, before we truly drift off, I realize we missed something. We talked about how dangerous it was to be a king. We talked about exploding cannons and angry monkeys. But we haven't talked about the most excruciating form of royal torture, etiquette. Specifically, the weaponized etiquette of the French court. Let's float back to the 17th century. To the man who invented the concept of being a celebrity, Louis XIV. The Sun King. Louis built Versailles for a reason. And it wasn't just because he liked gold leaf, although he really liked gold leaf. He built it to control the nobility. Remember those rebellious knights we talked about earlier? The ones who would get bored and start civil wars? Louis remembered them too. He had dealt with a rebellion called the Fronde when he was a kid. He hated it. So he came up with a brilliant plan. He would invite all the nobles to come live with him. He created a golden cage. If you wanted power, if you wanted money, if you wanted the king's favor, you had to be at Versailles. You had to leave your estate, abandon your local power base, and move into a tiny, cramped apartment in the palace attic. And once you were there, he kept you busy. Not with work. With nonsense. Louis turned his daily life into a performance art piece. Every single moment of his day, from the second he opened his eyes to the second he closed them, was a public ceremony. Let's walk through the lever. The waking up ceremony. It is 8 a.m. The king's valet wakes him up. But the king doesn't just get out of bed. That would be too simple. First, the overture. The valet opens the doors. A specific group of people is allowed in. The atre familier. This is the illegitimate sons, the grandchildren, and the first physician. The doctor checks the king. He kisses the king. Yes, kisses him. Then he rubs the king down. Then comes the grande atre. The great officers of the chamber, the great chamberlain, and some very lucky nobles who have a special warrant called a brevet d'affaires. The king is still in bed, by the way. He is probably wishing he could just hit snooze. But he has an audience. Then, he gets out of bed. He puts on his slippers. Now comes the shirt ceremony. This was the Super Bowl of French etiquette. The king takes off his nightshirt. He stands there, naked to the waist, in front of a room full of dukes and princes. A fresh shirt is brought in. But who gets to hand it to him? This was a matter of intense national importance. The Grand Chamberlain offers the shirt. But if a prince of the blood, a close relative, is in the room, the chamberlain has to give the shirt to the prince, and the prince gives it to the king. But wait. If the dauphin, the king's son, is there, the prince has to give it to the dauphin, who gives it to the king. Sometimes, this handoff took minutes. The king is standing there, shivering, half naked, while his relatives shuffle a linen shirt back and forth like a hot potato, trying to figure out who has the highest rank. Once the shirt is on, the dressing continues. One noble helps pull up the left stocking. Another noble pulls up the right stocking. It was an honor to help the king put on his pants. People fought for this privilege. Why? Because if you were the guy holding the king's pants, you had 30 seconds to whisper in his ear. Your Majesty, my cousin needs a job. Your Majesty, I have a lawsuit I need you to look at. The pants holder was the most powerful lobbyist in France. This ceremony went on for an hour. Every morning. And it happened in reverse every night at the coucher. If you were a courtier, your entire existence revolved around trying to get into that room. If the king didn't see you, you didn't exist. Louis had a famous phrase for people who stopped coming to court. I do not know him. If Louis XIV said, I do not know him, your social life was over. You might as well move to a farm and raise goats. But let's say you made it. You were in the inner circle. You lived at Versailles. Was it a paradise? No. It was a smelly, crowded tenement building with chandeliers. Versailles was built on a swamp. It was damp. The chimneys smoked. The rooms were freezing in the winter because the ceilings were 20 feet high and the fireplaces were decorative. The wine would sometimes freeze in the glasses at the dinner table. And the hygiene. Let's float over to the bathroom situation. Or rather, the lack of one. Versailles had hundreds of rooms, thousands of people, and 0 flushing toilets. They had chaises, purses, commode chairs. Basically a velvet chair with a hole in the seat and a pot underneath. If you were the king, you had a nice one. But if you were a random count living on the 3rd floor? You probably just used the chamber pot. And what did you do with the contents of the chamber pot? Well, the rules said you had to carry it to a designated disposal area. But the rules were hard to follow when you were running late for the king's dinner. So many people just dumped it. Out the window. Or in a corner of the hallway. The palace was notorious for the smell. Visitors wrote about it constantly. One observer said Versailles smelled of urine, fecal matter, and rot. The servants would try to clean it up. They would burn heavy incense and use strong perfumes to mask the odor. That's why French perfume became so famous. It wasn't just about smelling nice. It was about survival. You needed a cloud of musk and lavender just to walk down the hall of mirrors without gagging. And then there were the pests. The king's dogs were not house-trained. Louis loved dogs. He had poodles and spaniels running everywhere. They did their business wherever they pleased. And the people weren't much cleaner. Bathing was considered dangerous in the 17th century. Doctors thought that hot water opened your pores and let the miasma, disease air, into your body. So people didn't bathe. They dry-washed. They rubbed themselves with linen cloths and alcohol. Louis XIV famously took very few baths in his life. He washed his face, his hands, and his feet daily. But a full soak? Rarely. So imagine a room. It is overheated by thousands of candles. It is filled with 300 people wearing heavy velvet, wool, and silk. They haven't bathed in months. They are wearing wigs that are glued on with animal fat and infested with lice. There are dogs running around. And the windows are sealed shut because fresh air is dangerous. The smell must have been a physical wall that hit you when you walked in. But nobody cared about the smell. They only cared about the stool. The war of the stools. In the modern world, we worry about things like the economy or climate change. At Versailles, the single most important issue for about 50 years was, who gets to sit on what? The hierarchy of seating was a minefield. The armchair, fauteuil, only the king and queen could sit in armchairs with backs and armrests. The chair with a back, chaise, the king's children and grandchildren could sit on these. The stool, taburet, this was the holy grail. The taburet was a simple, backless upholstered stool. To us, it looks like something you'd rest your feet on. To a duchess in 1680, it was more valuable than a diamond mine. Only duchesses were allowed to sit on a taburet in the presence of the queen. Everyone else, countesses, marquises, barons, had to stand. And they had to stand for hours. The queen would hold her circle in the evening. She would play cards. The duchesses would rush in and grab the stools. They would sit down, their massive skirts billowing out like parachutes. The other ladies, the ones without stool privileges, had to stand in a circle around them. They had to stand until their feet swelled. They had to stand until they fainted. Fainting was very common. It wasn't just the corsets, it was the locked knees. There were bitter feuds over these stools. There is a story of a princess who arrived at the chapel and found that a duchess had taken her spot on a prayer cushion, which was a variation of the stool rule. The princess grabbed the cushion and threw it across the room. The duchess shoved the princess. It was a brawl in the house of God, all over a piece of velvet. Louis XIV loved this. He loved watching them fight. He would sometimes grant a brevet of the stool to a specific lady. It was a golden ticket. Suddenly she could sit. Her enemies would seethe with jealousy. It kept them distracted. If you are busy hating your neighbor because she has a stool and you don't, you aren't plotting to overthrow the king. But the etiquette applied to men too. Let's talk about the hat. Taking off your hat was a science. If you met a superior, you took it off with a sweeping gesture. If you met an equal, you lifted it slightly. If you met an inferior, you touched the brim. But what if you met a prince of the blood? You had to take it off. But what if you were a duke? The rules were so complex that some men just decided to carry their hats in their hands all day rather than risk making a mistake. They walked around holding their hats like steering wheels, terrified of putting them on their heads and accidentally insulting a cousin of the king. And the silence. When the king walked through the hall of mirrors, nobody spoke. Hundreds of people would line the walls. They would bow. The only sound was the clicking of the king's red heels. Only the king and his favorites were allowed to wear red heels, and the rustle of silk. The king would glance left and right. He might nod. He might smile. If he smiled at you, you were safe. If he frowned, you went back to your room and panicked. It was a high school cafeteria on a national scale. But the real victim of this system wasn't just the ego. It was the stomach. Let's float over to the king's dinner. The grand couvert. The king ate in public. Every night. He sat at a table alone, facing the room. A crowd of courtiers stood behind a barrier and watched him chew. It was like a zoo exhibit. Here we see the Rex Francorum consuming a pheasant. The food was cold. The kitchens at Versailles were a quarter of a mile away from the king's dining room. The food had to be carried through a maze of corridors, upstairs, and through crowds of people. By the time it arrived, the soup was lukewarm. The grease had congealed on the lamb. But the king ate it. He had an iron stomach. Louis XIV was a glutton. His autopsy showed that his stomach was twice the size of a normal human's. He could eat 4 plates of soup, a whole pheasant, a partridge, a big plate of salad, 2 slices of ham, mutton with garlic, a plate of pastry, and then fruit and hard-boiled eggs. In one sitting. And he ate with his fingers. Forks existed. But Louis thought they were pretentious. He preferred to grab the meat with his hands. And because the king did it, everyone else had to do it. So you have the most elegant court in Europe, people wearing thousands of dollars worth of lace, dipping their greasy fingers into bowls of stew and shoving meat into their mouths. Meanwhile, the courtiers watching him were starving. They weren't allowed to eat. They just had to watch. The smell of the food, even cold food, must have been torture. And if you were lucky enough to be invited to a feast, you had to be careful. You couldn't drink until the king drank. And when the king drank, everyone had to stop eating and bow. If you needed a drink, you had to signal a servant. The servant would bring a glass on a tray. You had to drink it quickly, in one go, and give the glass back. You weren't allowed to keep a glass on the table. So, dinner was a race against thirst, interrupted by constant bowing, eating cold meat with your hands, while wearing a wig that weighed 5 pounds. It sounds exhausting. But surely, the fashion made it worth it. Surely looking that good felt amazing? Let's float over to the wardrobe. Specifically, the things that were killing them. The toxic vanity. We know that fashion is pain. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, fashion was death. Let's start with the face. Pale skin was the ideal. It meant you didn't work in the fields. It meant you were rich. To achieve this, both men and women used a foundation called ceruse. It was a thick, white paste. It covered up smallpox scars. It gave you a smooth, porcelain look. The main ingredient? Lead. White lead. They were painting heavy metal directly onto their skin. Every single day. Lead is a neurotoxin. It absorbs through the skin. It causes hair loss. Which is why they needed the wigs. It causes gray gums. It causes skin to shrivel and age prematurely. Which meant they had to use more makeup to cover the damage. It also causes mental instability. The madness of some courtiers might have just been lead poisoning. They also wanted rosy cheeks. For rouge, they used cinnabar, which is a mineral form of mercury. So you have a lead base with a mercury finish. You are basically a walking hazardous waste site. And to accent their eyes? They use drops of belladonna. Deadly nightshade. It dilates the pupils. It makes you look doe-eyed and romantic. It also causes blindness if you use it too long. And hallucinations. So the average court beauty was slowly going bald, shaking from mercury tremors, and going blind, all while trying to balance on a stool she fought a duchess for. And then there were the corsets. We all know corsets were tight. But the court corsets were structural engineering. They were stiffened with whalebone, or even iron. They compressed the ribs. They shifted the internal organs. They made it impossible to take a deep breath. This is why the vapors and fainting were so common. It wasn't female frailty. It was hypoxia. They were suffocating. And for the men? The calves. Louis XIV was very proud of his legs. He was a dancer. He wanted to show off his calves. So men wore tight stockings and high heels. But if your calves weren't muscular enough, you wore false calves. Padding stuffed into your stockings. But sometimes the padding would slip. There are tragicomic stories of noblemen dancing a minuet, only to have their muscular calf slide down to their ankle in the middle of a bow. The humiliation was worse than death. Because at Versailles, ridicule was the ultimate weapon. If you looked stupid, if you fell, if you said the wrong thing, you were destroyed. Louis XIV was a master of the killing glance. But the courtiers were worse. They wrote satirical verses. They drew caricatures. There was a woman, the Duchess of Berry. She was notorious for her gluttony and her fashion disasters. She once decided to host a party while suffering from serious indigestion. Probably from the lead and the cold pheasants. She passed out in the middle of the room. The court didn't help her. They wrote songs about it. Nasty little rhymes that circulated in the coffee houses of Paris. This was the atmosphere. A high-pressure, toxic, smelly, sleep-deprived environment where your best friend would sell you out for a better chair, and your makeup was slowly eating your brain. But eventually, the party had to end. Louis XIV died in 1715. He had reigned for 72 years. He outlived his son and his grandson. He left the throne to his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV. On his deathbed, Louis XIV looked at the little boy and said, "Do not imitate me in my taste for building, nor in my taste for war. Try to relieve the burdens of your people, which I have been unable to do." It was a rare moment of clarity. He realized, at the very end, that the golden cage was a mistake. But the machine he built was too strong. The etiquette continued. The spending continued. The distance between the king and the people grew wider and wider. Louis XV kept it going. Louis XVI kept it going. Until 1789. When the people of Paris finally marched to Versailles, they didn't care about who had the right to sit on a stool. They wanted bread. They broke into the palace. They chased Marie Antoinette through those gilded hallways. And just like that, the bubble popped. The silence of the Hall of Mirrors was shattered by the sound of angry boots. The perfume couldn't hide the smell of revolution anymore. But that is a loud story. A story of guillotines and shouting. And we don't want shouting tonight. We want to stay in the quiet, dusty aftermath. Imagine Versailles today. The tourists are gone. It is night. The moon is shining through the windows. The halls are empty. The stools are roped off. The air is fresh, finally. You can almost hear the rustle of invisible silk. You can almost see the ghosts of the courtiers still arguing over who gets to stand closest to the door. They are trapped there forever. But you are free. You can wear sweatpants. You can sit in any chair you like. And you can go to sleep without asking the king for permission. Let's leave France behind. Let's float across the ocean. To a place where the dangers weren't about etiquette, but about the very wallpaper in your bedroom. Let's talk about the Victorian home. The arsenic green bedroom. We are back in the 19th century. But this time, we aren't looking at royals. We are looking at the middle class. You have a nice house. You have a fireplace. You have a cat. You feel safe. But you shouldn't. Because the Victorians had a talent for inventing things that were incredibly useful and incredibly deadly, and then putting them in every single room of the house. Let's start with the color green. In the mid-19th century, a new dye was invented. Chili's green. And later, Paris green. It was vibrant. It was emerald. It was the color of nature. The Victorians loved it. They used it for everything. They painted their walls green. They bought green wallpaper with lovely leaf patterns. They wore green dresses. They bought green toys for their children. They even used green food coloring to make fake vegetables look more appetizing. There was just one problem. To make that specific shade of green, you needed copper and arsenic. Lots of arsenic. A single ball gown dyed with Paris green could contain enough arsenic to kill 3 people. But the wallpaper was the real killer. You pasted it on your walls. The glue was damp. The air was damp. It was England, after all. Mold would grow on the back of the paper. The mold would eat the paste and react with the arsenic in the dye. It released a gas. Arsine gas. It was invisible. It had a faint smell of garlic, but most people didn't notice. So, you would go to sleep in your beautiful green bedroom. You would breathe the air. You would wake up with a headache. You would feel tired. Your eyes would be sore. "I need to rest," you would say. "I'll spend a few days in bed." So you stayed in the room, breathing more gas, getting sicker. The doctor would come. "He needs plenty of rest," he would say. "Keep him in his room." It was a death spiral. The room was killing you, and the cure was to stay in the room. Thousands of people died this way. Children faded away in their nurseries. Napoleon Bonaparte might have been one of them. When he was exiled to St. Helena, his house was painted with, you guessed it, Chilis green. Samples of his hair show massive levels of arsenic. He wasn't poisoned by a spy, he was poisoned by his decorator. But green wasn't the only danger. Let's look at the baby bottles. The Victorians invented a new type of baby bottle. It was glass, and it had a long rubber tube attached to the nipple. It was called the banjo bottle, because of its shape. It was designed for convenience. You could put the bottle in the crib, and the baby could feed itself through the tube. The murder bottle, they call it now. Why? Because you couldn't clean the tube. It was narrow. It was rubber. It was porous. Milk would get stuck inside. It would spoil. Bacteria would grow. But the Victorians didn't know about bacteria. They just rinsed it out and filled it up again. The tubes became breeding grounds for tuberculosis, cholera, and listeria. The infant mortality rate skyrocketed. But the bottles were so convenient that people kept using them for decades. And while the baby was drinking spoiled milk, the mother was wearing a crinoline. This was a cage worn under the skirt to make it wide. Extremely wide. It was made of steel hoops and flammable fabric. The problem was, you couldn't feel where the edge of your dress was. Women would walk past the fireplace. The edge of the skirt would brush the grate. Whoosh. The fabric was often treated with chemicals to make it stiff, which also made it burn faster. Thousands of women burned to death because their dresses were too big for their environments. There are stories of theater fires where women couldn't escape because they got wedged in the doors by their own skirts. It was a world where everyday objects were traps. The bread you ate? It was white. Why? Because the baker added aluminum, to bleach the flour. It made the bread look expensive, but it caused malnutrition and digestive problems. The milk? It was watered down. To make it look creamy again, they added chalk or plaster of Paris. And to keep it from going sour, they added formaldehyde. Yes, embalming fluid. In the milk. It was called the embalmed milk scandal. So, you have a society living in arsenic rooms, wearing flammable cages, drinking formaldehyde milk, and wondering why everyone looks so pale. It really makes you appreciate the FDA, doesn't it? But let's step away from the domestic horrors. We have talked about knights, kings, courtiers, and homeowners. There is one group left. The people who thought they could conquer nature. The explorers. The people who looked at a map, saw a blank spot labeled, "Here be dragons," and said, "I'm going to go there and probably die of scurvy. Let's float to the ice." To the obsession with the poles. The frozen dreams. There is something very soothing about the Arctic. It is white. It is silent. It is clean. It is also incredibly hostile to human life. But in the 19th century, the British Navy decided they needed to find the Northwest Passage, a route over the top of Canada to get to China. They sent the best ships, the best men. The most famous disaster was the Franklin expedition. Sir John Franklin set out in 1845 with 2 ships, the Terror and the Erebus. Great names for ships. Really setting the tone there. They had everything. Steam engines. A library of 1,000 books. Enough food for 3 years. They even had a player piano. They sailed into the ice. And the ice just closed behind them. They didn't disappear instantly. They sat there for 2 years. Imagine the boredom. The ship is frozen in a block of ice. It's dark for 6 months of the year. You can't go anywhere. You just sit in the hull, listening to the ice groan and crack, squeezing the ship. And then, things started to go wrong. The food. It was canned. This was new technology. The contract for the canning was rushed. The lead solder used to seal the cans dripped into the food. Lead poisoning again. The Victorian curse. The men started to go mad. They became weak. Their gums bled from scurvy. Eventually, Franklin died. The ships were crushed. The survivors decided to walk. They tried to walk hundreds of miles across the frozen tundra to the nearest outpost. They pulled lifeboats on sledges. But here is the strange part. When rescue teams found the sledges years later, they found weird things. They didn't just pack food. They packed silverware. Sterling silver forks with the family crest. They packed chocolate. They packed books. One man packed a pair of slippers. They were dying, dragging hundreds of pounds of useless luxury items across the ice, because they couldn't let go of who they were. They were British officers. They needed their teaspoons. They all died. Every single one. The Inuit locals told stories later of ghost men stumbling through the snow, falling down and not getting up. It's a chilling image. A line of men, slowly fading into the white, silenced by the cold. The Terror and the Erebus sank. They were only found recently, perfectly preserved in the freezing water. The dishes were still on the shelves. It's the ultimate sleep. The deep freeze. And on that cold, quiet note, I think we have reached the end of our journey. We have traveled from the mud of Agincourt to the halls of Versailles.